Well, October was a busy month for home buyers, with sales increasing 20% relative to September. Are these the early signs of our market rebounding? I'm Adina with Adina YBR Vancouver Real Estate Group and Oakland Realty here with your November 2025 market update. Let's jump right into the numbers and take a look at what's happening. Greater Vancouver Realtors reported 2,255 home sales on the MLS in the month of October. This represents an increase of 20% relative to September, yet it's still a decrease of 14% relative to October last year, and it's about 14.5% below the 10-year sales average for the month of October. While this is still below the 10-year historical average for the month of October, what we pointed out last month and remains to be true is that the overall trend is that we are moving closer towards historical norms. So back in March, we were 37% below the 10-year historical average for that month, and that's continued to decline. In September, we were 20% below the historical average, and now we're just 14.5% below that average. So overall, our market does seem to be moving closer towards that 10-year historical average. Looking at this by property type, we see that sales of detached homes reached 693 sales in the month of October, and this is down 4% relative to this time last year. For attached townhomes and duplexes, we had 477 home sales registered, and this is a decrease of 4.8% relative to this time last year. And for condo apartments, we saw the biggest decrease with just 1,071 homes sold, and this is a decrease of 23% relative to this time last year. On the supply side, we saw fewer homes coming onto the market. We had just over 5,400 homes newly listed for sale on the MLS, and this represented a decrease of 17% relative to September. It's almost unchanged relative to this time last year, and it's just 16% above that 10-year average for the month of October. And as a result of the increase in the pace of sales and the decrease in the pace of new listings coming onto the market, the total inventory that's available for sale on the market actually declined in the month of October. In the month of October, we had just under 16,400 homes available for sale on the MLS. And this represents a decrease of 4% relative to September, yet it is still up 13% relative to October last year, and it's 36% above the 10-year sales average for the month of October. And again, the underlying trend we've seen is similar to what we saw in the sales activity, and that's the differential between the 10-year historical average and when we're at has continued to decrease since the spring. So in April, we were at 48% above the 10-year sales average, and now we're just 36% above that 10-year sales average. And this rebalancing between increasing sales and decreased inventory has caused a big change in the sales to active listings ratio, which, if you recall, is our leading indicator showing us if prices are on their way up or down and what kind of market we're in. In the month of October, our sales to active listings ratio increased to 14.2%. This puts us back in balanced market territory, up from buyer's market territory in the month of September. And if you've been watching our videos, you'll recall that the sales to active listings ratio is looking at the number of sales in a given month divided by the active listings left over at the end of that month. And when this ratio is below 12% for a sustained period of time, we're in buyer's market territory and prices are typically on their way down. When this ratio is above 20% for a sustained period of time, we're in seller's market territory and prices are typically on their way up. And between 12 to 20%, we're in balanced market territory, which is exactly where we are now. What's really interesting to see is that this ratio has been declining since its peak in February and March this year when it was at 14.9%. And it's shown slight declines every month up until September. This is the first month where it's actually increased, and it's rebounded back to almost where we were in February, March this year. And if this ratio remains in this range for several months in a row, we expect to see prices stabilize. Looking at this by property type, we see that for detached homes, the sales to active listings ratio is currently 11%, which is in buyer's market territory, but it is up from 8.5% last month. For attached townhomes and duplexes, the ratio is currently 17.6%, so in balanced market territory, and this is up from 12.7% in the previous month. And for condo apartments, the ratio is currently 15.5%, which again is balanced market territory, and it's up from 13.3% last month. So what exactly is happening with prices? Well, prices actually declined in the month of October. So the HPI composite benchmark price for all property types is currently $1,132,500, and this represents a decrease of 0.8% relative to September, and it's down 3.4% relative to this time last year. Looking at this by property type, we see that the HPI benchmark price index for detached homes is $1,916,400. This represents a decrease of 0.9% relative to September, and it's down 4.3% relative to October last year. For attached townhomes and duplexes, the HPI benchmark price is currently $1,066,700. This represents a decrease of 0.3% relative to September, and it's down 3.8% relative to this time last year. And finally, for condo apartments, The HPI benchmark price is currently $718,900. This represents a decrease of 1.4% relative to September, and it's down 5.1% relative to October of last year. Looking at this across different submarkets in Metro Vancouver, we see a consistent trend with sales increasing and the pace of inventory either remaining flat or decreasing. Starting off with the downtown market, we see that the pace of sales increased by 12% in the month of October relative to September, whereas inventory levels decreased by 2%. And this pushed the sales active listings ratio up to 13%, which is back in balanced market territory. On the west side of Vancouver, we saw sales increasing by 24% relative to September, whereas inventory levels remained flat. The sales active listings ratio there is 9%, so still in buyer's market territory. But if we're looking in the entry-level segments, we're in seller's market territory. For example, the $2.2 to $2.5 million range is at a 30% sales active listings ratio there. Also on the west side of Vancouver, we see that for attached condos and townhomes, sales increased by a whopping 47% relative to September, whereas inventory levels dropped by 5%. And the sales active listings ratio there now is 18%, which is balanced market territory. On the east side of Vancouver for detached home, we saw sales increasing by 61% relative to September, whereas inventory levels declined by 5%. And the sales active listings ratio there is 15%, which again is balanced market territory. Also on the east side of Vancouver for condos and townhomes, we saw sales increasing by 22%, whereas inventory levels dropped by 6%. And the sales active listings ratio is now at 21%, which is technically seller's market territory. And in some submarkets there, it's as high as 40%. In North Vancouver for the detached market, we saw sales increasing by 60%, whereas inventory levels dropped by 9%. And the sales active listings ratio there now is 22%, which again is seller's market territory. And in some submarkets, depending on price point, it's as high as 46%. And in North Vancouver for condos and townhomes, we saw a similar trend, although a bit more muted, whereas sales increased just 3% relative to September and inventory levels decreased by 3%. And the sales active listings ratio there now is 19%, which is on the cusp between a balanced market and seller's market territory. While it's too early to label this as an official rebound, we'll need to see a few more months of activity. We are seeing encouraging signs in the market that the market is coming back to more historical norms. For us personally, we had more transactions in the month of October than we saw in all of August and September combined. And the pace of activity that we're seeing from buyers in the marketplace and their willingness to write offers does seem to be higher, and that momentum is increasing into November. So I'm very curious to see what the stats for November will be like, but overall we're seeing encouraging signs here. If you're thinking of making a move or you'd like to get a better understanding of what's happening in the submarket you're looking to buy or sell in, you can schedule a consultation by clicking the link below if you're watching this on YouTube, or if you're watching this on Instagram, you could click the link in my bio. And if you'd like to stay up to date with what's happening in the market, you can subscribe here on YouTube, or you can follow me on Instagram at adina.ybr. That's it for now. Looking forward to seeing you in December. Thanks.